out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Welcome to You Have to Say That's Magnificent, our World Cup themed subsection here at Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating. We're having a little look at matters way into the past tonight on a World Cup theme, starting a few little delves into the past of some of the World Cup winning managers. And today we are going way back in time to the only manager to have won the World Cup twice, at least so far. If a certain French Didier Deschamps wins it coming up this year, I suppose he'll emulate. But this man not only did it twice, but did it back-to-back, 1934, 1938. We're talking Vittorio Pozzo of the Italian team of the day. Someone who history has not necessarily been kind to in his achievements, given the time period and the regime he did it in, the nation he did it for, including, I guess, nefarious means, allegedly, by which Italy won in 34 and the political implications and protests in 38. We're going to delve a little deeper into the man who achieved those feats, who created a strong Italian team and various controversies around it. So we'll strap in for Il Duce Mussolini doing Il Duce Mussolini things as well. We'll have some fascist salutes, some black shirts on the World Cup field, a potential win or die motivational message, and 2 World Cup wins thrown in for good measure. We are with the football writer Chris Evans, author of How to Win the World Cup, which has an updated release this year, perfectly timed, of course, for the upcoming show. Welcome back onto the pod, Chris. It's been a little while since we last spoke on the matter of your World Cup book, but you are most welcome back.
Great, thank you. Yeah, every 4 years, hopefully there'll be 4 years between the next appearance after that.
Absolutely. We will make sure it's far sooner than that. In fact, I know for a fact it will be far sooner than that. So excellent stuff. Also, we've got Matthew Gibbs here with us, raconteur of all things Birmingham City. He has a champion scarf up behind him in the background, I see. Nice to see. In this case, he's also a bit of a, your boys took a hell of a beating social conscience, I like to think, Matthew, if that's not putting too much onto you. On the many intersections between football, politics and society. Superbly knowledgeable in those areas. But I think you have your hands full on this particular topic, Matthew.
That was the nicest introduction I've ever got. That was. I love that. Speak more on my behalf, Aidan. I find Italy is my favourite footballing country, and the early Italian days are fascinating and complicated, and this is sure to be an interesting discussion.
Absolutely. So let's waste no time and we'll get stuck right in there. So, Chris, when you were floating the idea of this one and giving a few bits of background detail, you flagged from the off a quote from Pozzo at the start of the 1938 World Cup, where he's stating that his players wouldn't dream of making anything political out of it, that they just had to perform the fascist salute, as that's what representing Italy in 1938 entailed. Equally, 34, I suppose. He says they represent their country and naturally wear its colours and insignias with dignity. And he talks of his players facing expected barrage of abuse, which was indeed true, and of holding their salute until the hisses have stopped, which is exactly what they had to do in their opening game in 38. And they waited for the abuse to stop, lowered their arms, and then raised them again just to prove a point. Is it any wonder then that Pozzo is implicated by history? And we'll talk a lot of the number of specifics as we go through, but sort of some initial thoughts overall, regardless of whether it's true, or whatever his true thoughts and feelings may have been, he is forever, I guess, associated with this fascist regime.
He is, yeah. And he's a fascinating character because you'd think he ought to be revered. You know, the only man, as you say, who's won a World Cup as a manager twice. But it's a name that people aren't familiar with. And that's not just because it happened in the 1930s, but just because there's that sort of fascist smell around him. And, you know, whether he wasn't a member of the fascist party, but it's very difficult to break up the sort of fascist impact that 2 World Cup wins had under Mussolini with just being a football man. And of course, there were so many other different social pressures, personal safety pressures as well, kind of being a prominent person during that time in Italy. But to try and say that he was definitely one side or the other, it probably can't fall either way. He must be in the middle somewhere, if not more to one side than the other. And he's a fascinating guy.
Fascinating guy, and I don't want to use the term proper football man. That sounds ridiculous. That means something else, doesn't it, these days? But a well-educated footballing man. Italy in this time benefit, I guess, from a lot of Central European competition. They came from a region that was very strong of football. If you think of the likes of Austria and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and I guess to a slightly lesser extent, Switzerland, in that region at that time, regularly playing each other, regularly pushing the game on in terms of its technical and tactical awareness, whereas some of us in these isles were still very rigid in our thinking and views. We'll touch on some of that as well. Matthew, I guess on that sort of similar theme of initial thoughts of Pozzo and the implications and the areas that he's sort of linked to, should a sporting triumph lose some respect, is that the right term, or have some shine taken off it by the backdrop by which it was achieved, or the name of what it was achieved in, possibly more pertinently? You think of Berlin 1936, which was obviously very much in this era. It's a tainted competition, even though German success was overshadowed ultimately by the fine achievements of somebody who was the opposite of a lot of what they stood for. But in this case, 2 World Cups either side of that had Italian success, all achieved, and indeed in that Olympics as well, actually, in terms of football, all achieved in Mussolini's name. Does that take away from the achievement?
It does taint it, I think, especially when you consider, from what my understanding of Mussolini's brand of fascism was, is that he wanted to control everything and was one of the first people to sort of recognise that football, being the sport of the masses, that it was a tool to be used to further his message and to further control people and to further, I don't think it's sports washing at that point, but to further use Italian football, the national side, to project, to embody the principles and the personality that he wanted Italy to have at that time. And whether or not Pozzo had, whether or not he had sympathies in Mussolini's direction, whether he was a fascist or not, or the claims or the information that had come out in the years since say no, but his brand of football and his sensibilities and his experience in the war sort of aligns perfectly with what Mussolini wanted from his footballing side. So I can see why many people don't know of Pozzo and don't want to talk about him, because it's incredibly complicated, and it doesn't really stop at Pozzo or the World Cups either, because I could be wrong when I say that Mussolini was involved in the formation of Serie A back in the 30s.
No, you're right. The fascist regime was, whether it was him personally, I don't know. It's very senior officials that he'd appointed. You're absolutely right. Yes, there was, I think it was the mid-20s or mid to late 1920s with the Carta di Viareggio, which set out a way of sort of nationalizing what was a regional sport. But not only that, so that's Serie A, as you mentioned, but then there was also creating a few super clubs out of smaller ones. So this is where Roma came from. Lazio sort of stayed on the outside of it, which is ironic when you consider the implications that you think of that club and its fan base in more recent times. Huge stadium construction. You think of the likes of Bologna and the big tower there. That's a sort of fascist structure. A few others. I think there's several other clubs. I can't think of them all offhand, but yeah, that's definitely part of what was laid out. And then you've also got the whole Oriundi concept of bringing Italian or players of Italian heritage back to the motherland, if you like, which, in club terms, I guess that was to strengthen the clubs, the league, and all of that as well. And then by extension, the national team. They were, Pozzo himself, he noted they could die for Italy because they could end up fighting for the country. So why couldn't they play for Italy? So yeah, you're absolutely right. The whole incarnation of Italian football at this time is not just utterly linked to the fascist regime, it is positively being pushed and developing because of the fascist regime, and a lot of it we still see now.
To say it's complicated is an understatement. It is as you say, that the signs are still there. The Bologna example, that stadium was something I'd mark down as like a monument. It's like not a fascist monument, but like an echo, right? It's something that was built at the time and still exists today, and people probably don't want to talk about how it came to be. And it's not just the leagues, it's not all of that. It's everything down to some of the players as well. I'm sure we'll get into in a bit, but some of the players that were chosen in the 34 and 38 World Cups were not necessarily best mates with Mussolini, but had relationships with him. So it is impossible to unlink the World Cup wins from Mussolini and fascism.
What do you think is interesting though is that Pozzo, he wasn't just, as much as he was a proud Italian, he hadn't just spent all his life in Italy. And I think that's what, again, it muddies the waters in terms of kind of to be able to distinctly put Pozzo into a bucket. I mean, he spent time in France, in Switzerland. He famously over in England, which is where he kind of fell in love with football, which is, I think it makes it an interesting sort of, where do things land? Because, to have gone to these countries, particularly, France and England at the time, this is a place where he wasn't exposed to all the sort of ever-changing Italian political scene. And the fact that, Mussolini was around since 1922 as a dictator and was, prominent before that, kind of, it shows what was influencing Pozzo and where does he sit from a football and a political side? Because he fights for Italy in the war, but he spends so much time out of Italy. So I think again, he's an enigma in a way, isn't he? And I mean, it's fascinating, and I think it's almost that sort of, because it happened so long ago, and while he was still a journalist after the Second World War, you never truly kind of open up and grasp what Pozzo's about, do you? It's not like today where you kind of get deep dives about managers all the time. There's a bit of mystery surrounding him, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that sort of speaks of the era as well in terms of football. It's almost the three pre-war World Cups are often forgotten in some regard because that big gap between 38 and 1950. It's easy to sort of see them as, something that's so long ago as to be irrelevant to anything more modern. And it makes it equally fascinating to look into, but it's certainly a lesser told story or less understood. When you talked about Pozzo there in terms of his influence, well-travelled as a football character, his footballing education was a little bit, pan-European, if you like. So that's, I guess, quite progressive, quite modern, quite a interesting way for somebody in that era to sort of gain their football knowledge and understanding and tactical insight, I suppose. And I don't know, it's hard to tell, again, when you look back at things from so long ago, of whether he was at the forefront of tactical development or whether he was sticking rigidly to some sort of, I don't know, strength through football type ideal that you might imagine a fascist promoting. What do we know in terms of him and his tactical approach, and whether he was revolutionary or just, well organized?
Well, it was in England where he fell in love with the game. I think that he kind of travelled around, and it wasn't until kind of pretty late, really. I suppose maybe it was where football was at the time, but it wasn't until he came over to England to understand the textile business, actually to kind of get involved with his family's business and kind of understanding how the textile factories, I think it was at Bradford that he was there. It was only there that he really got into football and learnt about it. But what's interesting about his tactical influences is that he's learnt from the Northwest. I mean, there was no sign that he met Jimmy Hogan, obviously, who's the tactical forefather of a lot of, what we're seeing today when it kind of filters all the way down to Pep Guardiola and beyond. But there's no idea that no record that he actually met Hogan, but he must have seen evidence of what was happening there because he was in the same area. He was in his stomping ground. And while, Hogan had to go to Europe to get his ideas across, you'd imagine that what Pozzo was inspired by was actually that sort of thing, because his approach doesn't go down that sort of industrial football routes that kind of dominated the British Isles at that time. And I think that's perhaps where you can see maybe that is sort of cocktail of influences come into it, because he's gone and he's seen something, but he's not just mimicked what he's seen as the primary approach in England at the time. And he comes over, and yes, he's kind of mixing in what he's seen and what he's heard. And he was inspired by some of what had gone on in that Danubian school with kind of Austria and Hungary, with, you know, Meisel, Kirchner and the likes. But he kind of sees what that sort of influence that eventually works down that family tree. But he then brings his own Italian side to that. And I think that's where the sort of discipline comes in. And I really believes in the pragmatism, the making sure that you're solid, the discipline. It wasn't kind of like the free and easy approach that kind of got him going. So I think he always brings all of that together and then adds a sprinkle of his own sort of Pozzoism on top of that makes it, you know, characterizes kind of the Italian way to play almost at the time.
Oh, that makes it quite fits in with, I guess, what we think of the Italian stereotype of very disciplined, very organized, very structured, with a little bit of flair at the right time. Whereas, as you say, yes, in Hungary and Austria and Czechoslovakia at this time, it was more about, you know, deep lying forwards and adjustments to how things played, and free flowing, attacking intricacy rather than robust, organized, disciplined approach. That sort of leads on, I think, Matthew, to a quite, well, potentially interesting point. Pozzo, as Chris says there, he was an organizer, he was a disciplinarian. He had a military background, as we've mentioned. Strict discipline in terms of within the squad and the team and so on. You know, he was in control. I think that's clear. Is he then, when we then project forward onto what regime he was working under and who they were representing, the perfect character for the national team under a fascist regime?
All of the Mussolini sensibilities aligned with how Pozzo saw football, and it is a perfect. Maybe, well, is it the right man in the right time, or he was the right man in the wrong time? I do find it fascinating how much of his, from what I've read, is how much of his footballing approach was inspired by his time in the military. I think it's obviously not the same sort of thing, but sort of remind me about, you know, Total Football, how Total Football is so inspired by Dutch culture and Dutch landscapes, and how that distills itself into a footballing approach. And for the same with Pozzo in a lot of ways, like using what his experiences in Manchester, in the north of England, using his experiences in war experiences, living and working under a fascist regime, and using all of that together to do things a little differently to great success. Another thing to mention, I think, because I do find this sort of pre-World War II era of Italian football interest, and I've written in the past about Pro Vercelli, club in Piedmont in Italy, who were the dominant force in like the 1910s and 1920s, and a lot of their approach came from discipline and came from the fact that they had a gym attached to their club, when a lot of other clubs at the time didn't have that. So they had the fittest players going, which is why they were often, you know, outlasting and outscoring opposition teams. And Pozzo's first bunch of, I think I want to say the Olympic squads in 1914, 1912. No, those days don't make sense because that was the First World War. His first range of Italian squads for the Olympics was a lot of Pro Vercelli players, because they were the fittest around, they were the most successful, and sort of that carried on throughout his regime. So he's a disciplinarian, highly organised, and a sensible man who knows what players to take advantage of at the time. And I think all of that sort of is really represented by Mussolini as well. I think it's an interesting parallel.
What do you think, Chris? Do you think it takes a certain type of character to flourish as a football manager in such a time and place? We sort of touched on it earlier, that sports being used for propaganda purposes. Mussolini was, well, the first prime instigator of such a thought, I think, with the 34 World Cup, wasn't he? Does it take a certain type of character to actually be the conduit through, I guess, which the strength of a nation is portrayed? It's,
I guess, a wider socio kind of political question, really, is that, you know, how does Mussolini kind of establish himself? And there was obviously a void that he kind of walked into in the early 20s. But is that because Italy was, as a lot of Europe were, and, obviously it opened the door for Hitler ultimately in Germany too. But is that because Mussolini is already kind of pulling on the strings of a lot of Italian values that are always well respected? And, Pozzo would actually be part of that, as would any Italian. It'd be very difficult to avoid that at the time. So it comes into it is, what inspires the other? So is this approach kind of led by Mussolini, or has Mussolini got into the place because he kind of instills those values that a lot of Italians kind of cling on to anyway? So, yeah, and I think that because Pozzo has, there was obviously a lot of nationalism at the time, and, especially following the First World War, Pozzo kind of being part of that himself, you would feel something, a staunch sort of nationalism and making sure that you are representing your country, whether you kind of buy into the sort of politics or not. So I think when he gets hired, I think it's quite interesting because it's not, it's just before Mussolini's real peak. While Mussolini's in power, he doesn't kind of really, I was going to say kick on, but he doesn't kind of like really kind of push in the same way that he does, in the following years. So Pozzo, it's difficult to know without kind of like the being in-depth sort of records of this, that was he brought in initially because he was the right man to deliver success, or was he brought in because he was the right man to represent Mussolini? I would argue that most coaches probably, because it was a position of power in a sort of a time when the military was obviously quite prominent across Europe for every nation, that he probably was in a position where any coach given that place would have been a strong disciplinarian. They would have wanted it to be like staunchly organised. There would have been a lot of drills, particularly in Italy at the time. So he's probably a product of the world that's around him, rather than kind of like been cherry picked. And perhaps he was just the most successful person to bring in at that time because he had been kind of involved with the Italian national team previously. He had been strongly involved in the growth of Italian football and had, coached successful teams. So it would have been a suggestion perhaps that's what kind of led him into that place, rather than kind of being the sort of, the perfect fascist man. Would the perfect fascist man in a football sense be someone who is successful? That is probably first and foremost the most important thing to get him in there. And if he is a military man as well, he's used to taking orders. He's used to kind of standing in line and making sure that this is what he does. And he clearly extols a lot of these values. So he ticks so many of these boxes, but so probably did a lot of people at that time.
I guess it's something you have to acknowledge when we try to judge how fascist or otherwise somebody was, is how much choice you have in the matter when you're living in such a time and place. We can't choose what era we live in. And if you're an Italian football coach in this era, you are therefore linked to fascism, whether you like it or not. And as you mentioned there, Chris, the phrase you said, whether you buy into the politics or not, you have little option. It's almost as though, I guess we see it sometimes today with club managers, and we can rail against them whether they avoid the topic on certain things. I know, Matthew, we've spoken in the past of certain Northeast clubs and ownership, and whether people do or don't speak on such matters or ignore them and focus solely on the football. That's probably something you can make a more conscious choice of here and now. In 1930s Italy, probably less so. So whether we are projecting onto him something that he had absolutely no choice in having to do, I guess, is the question.
I mean, it's fascinating because, like, as we've said before, but he's a bit of an unknown. Like, it's a bit of a blank canvas in a lot of ways. Like, all we have are the records of his decisions, essentially. So we can only glean from that what we know of the time and what we know of him and his football and stuff like that. We don't know anything about the decisions he made, like, or his private thoughts, his private opinions, what he did, how he chilled out, like what he did away from the football pitch. All we know of him really is that he was this disciplinarian guy. He was a highly successful football coach. There's little things maybe that throws it all into question. I'm right in saying that he never got paid, not a penny or whatever the lira was, the currency at the time. So in 20 years of managing Italy for Mussolini, he never got paid. So not that is, fair compensation for representing a fascist regime, but it sort of makes you wonder about his state of mind, maybe. Like, it was never about the money, it was all about what representing the country, which at the time is a fascist country, or it's just, did he want to just stay in that position because he loved football and he loved coaching, and that's just all he knew and all he wanted to do. And then, I mean, I'm sure we'll come to it, but some of the decisions he takes, some of the actions he encourages, like the fascist salutes in '38, it's very questionable, and does make me think a little bit of, well, we still today have a lot of problems in Italian football with racism and homophobia and, you know, all the bad stuff. And whenever this sort of stuff is talked about in sort of the general media, the answer from ultras who basically are being racist to their own players sometimes is that this is like a gladiatorial arena. This is anything goes. We have this mentality of, when you're in this arena, when you are, you know, playing this sport, we can say and do anything because it's acceptable here, and we will do anything to give ourselves an edge. And maybe, I don't know, maybe Pozzo had a similar mindset when it came to trying to get an advantage on the football field.
Well, he certainly had an advantage on the football field in the 1934 World Cup. I think that's fair to say, and possibly off it as well. So I mentioned earlier how Mussolini was a trailblazer, if you like, in terms of sports propaganda, set the template for how to use a sporting competition for such purposes. In the 1934 World Cup, the Nazis, I guess, were taking note ahead of their Olympics 2 years later. But in 1934, it was a perfect showcase for Italian fascist efficiency and organizational ability. We mentioned about the stadia that got built in advance of this. There's obviously the never-ending joke about the trains being on time in a fascist Italy. That was certainly something of a way they projected themselves onto the world of how well organized they were. There was significant state funding for the tournament. There was promotional posters reflecting their strength, fascist iconography and insignia everywhere. And of course, they had a strong football team. But it was one that had to win, I guess, especially in a home competition, if their fascist superiority was to be proven, in inverted commas. There's all sorts of rumours and speculation abounding about coercion or influence over referees in some games in particular as they worked their way through. It was a straight knockout in 1934. Italy actually had to qualify as well for it, despite being host. So that's an interesting side point. In their quarterfinal with Spain, it ended in a 1-1 draw, and the referee, according to one Spanish player, supposedly let Italy kick us off the field, interestingly, while the referee in the replay, which is a different referee, the replays in those days for drawn games, disallowed 2 Spanish goals, ignored several heavy Italian challenges, and favoured the home side throughout. This is, as we were mentioning before we started off air, this is based, of course, on reports from the time in the written press, really, because we can't necessarily judge for ourselves from footage. So it is hard to know exactly how everything went. Italy won that quarterfinal 1-0 thanks to Giuseppe Meazza scoring the winner. The referee, intriguingly, never refereed an international again. We'll just go ... on that one. There was semi-final. Even Eklund, Swedish referee, both for their semi-final and the final. More suspicion there of whether he had dinner with, well, I think it's pretty clear he did have dinner with the Italian regime prior to both games, and quite how much influence was exerted then. One interesting point noted by the Austrians in the semi-final was that the referee intercepted a pass from one Austrian player to another and returned it to an Italian. Again, who knows how true that is, or whether it's something that got embellished during the war years. It is impossible to know. But 1934, Chris, the influence of Mussolini on the tournament as a whole is huge. And then, of course, on Italy's progress is more than significant. How much of an asterisk does that put on what was, of course, a fine footballing achievement?
I mean, quite a significant asterisk, I'd imagine, even by today's standards for asterisks. I mean, Mussolini was so keen on getting that World Cup. I think that FIFA originally appeared to be favouring Sweden as hosts, but actually Mussolini directly lobbied FIFA, and you mentioned the state funding, to make sure that it was going to arrive in Italy. Now, that is, to go to those sort of extents, failure is not an option. And I think that as much as Mussolini liked to be the great host, he got people there. He was the man and wanted to be involved with it. There's no way that meeting referees the night before knockout matches, it doesn't look good. And while there was never any, hard proof, if we were looking today and you kind of thought, okay, let's say, Aidan, you're a Newcastle fan, right? So if it was like, the night before a key match for Newcastle before the, playing Sunderland in the derby, and you've got Eddie Howe.
Let's not go there, Chris. Oh, God.
Maybe he could have done with doing it, to be honest. But if you've got Eddie Howe kind of going for dinner with him, the referee beforehand, there would be question marks about this, right? And it's, I suppose there wasn't the same sort of optics as there are today, that you have to be aware kind of what's going around, the connotations. But, there was no, it seems there was no there's no hiding that Mussolini was having dinner with these people. But, to be having dinner with referees, that does leave a little bit of a smell around it. And I guess this is where there is a question around Pozzo, in a sense that if people are questioning the legitimacy of winning, and, we are only coming off predominantly British written reports, or it will be kind of like, as is the nature of the world at large at that time, the Allied sense of history. How many times do you go to a game and the home supporters will tell you the referee was awful, and they'll tell you that he did all of this sort of stuff? And I suppose at that time there is a question there, but there's a lot of this sort of inclination. But if there was that question for Pozzo, would he not be saying, well, hold on, I'm here for the football, and there is now, a question over the success. There's a question about how much what I'm doing is inputting. And if he felt that principled, would he be the sort of person that would pull away from it? Now, obviously, there are different issues, and there was that sort of voluntary obedience of the day and kind of standing up against it. It takes a brave person to do that, and he would be publicly shamed at best and punished at worst for that. But you'd think that if it really mattered to him and it was football first, that having all of this going around your success, your big achievement, would be highly questionable. And that you would have thought that there might be more signs that Pozzo wasn't happy with what was going on. And, it's important to say, there was no suggestion that Pozzo was involved with the referees, but whether he was directly involved or not, he must have benefited from this sort of stuff going on around him and his team and his country in that tournament.
Yeah, absolutely. Matthew, any 34 thoughts?
No, I echo what Chris has said. I think there kind of has to be a point. Like, I think there's not rumours about Mussolini bribing the Greece team that Italy played in the qualifiers to get into the World Cup, and bribing them so they would drop out of the qualifiers so Italy would qualify. I think what Chris says is right. There comes a point, and it's probably lends itself to why there's so many question marks around Pozzo. Like, at what point do you go, yeah, this is weird. Like, maybe I don't want to win a World Cup this way. Maybe I don't want my proudest moment to be associated with dodgy referees and rumours of bribery. And it's difficult as well, because I always think, unlike other sports, I think football is one that is incredibly difficult to fix a match. You can engineer a situation and make it highly favourable for yourself or for a certain team, but to rig it and to make it so that one side wins and one side loses, I think is near impossible, unless, and this probably lends itself to 38, where if there's like threats to life and stuff like that. So it's unfortunate for Pozzo, and it doesn't help him, and just the question marks still remain about him and how much he knew and how much he was willing to put up with. Or maybe, as we've said, he was a soldier. Maybe he just did as he was told.
Well, true. I mean, on that, of course, there was the assimilation of South American players we alluded to earlier. We had in this 1934 team Luis Monti, who had been part of the Argentina side, who were runners-up in the 1930 World Cup. Raimondo Orsi, I think, was another one who was a key player, another Argentinian. There were several who'd made it into this squad. And Pozzo, I guess, had little option in that regard, but to ensure their assimilation, because they were as Italian as the regime viewed it. as anyone else. And so was that equally potentially an early instance of not gaming the system, but seeking to gain every advantage possible by changing their own definition of what being an Italian was? There's many layers you could go into on that.
But
equally,
sorry to jump in here, Aidan, but I find that this part fascinating because it seems to be the very antithesis of what I think fascism to be. Is that they especially in that part of time, it's all about purity, right? It's all about you want pure Italians or pure Germans or whatever. So then they are assimilating South American players, which seem, I don't know, I guess it's maybe Chris would know more than me, but maybe this is a bit more representative of Mussolini's brand of fascism, where it's adaptable, right? It changes. It's not one thing and will always be one thing. It changes over the years, and whatever benefits Italy, whatever benefits him and his system is what they'll do to get ahead.
Yeah, I mean that seems to be about right, and I think that Mussolini, we all know he wasn't the prominent fascist leader of the 1930s, right? And I think that the prominent one, I mean, he had a clear vision of where he was going. And I suppose you're right, Mussolini, it seems to be that whatever keeps him in power and serves him seems to be the most important. Whereas there was a real sort of ideology with Hitler that he wanted everyone to be following. And I think that is probably the difference here. And I think this is where, again, Pozzo, because he's so well travelled, he could speak multiple languages. So when he's kind of bringing in that sort of Italian diaspora and bringing people with that sort of heritage into the national team, it is possible that he just sees this as a growing Italy, and this is a way for a growing Italy. And you hear the term fascism, and yes, it's very highly unpalatable, but it's not quite the same as it was in Germany. And maybe that's where, again, it's, where does Pozzo fall? Because you can, we've all been in jobs, not led by Mussolini or a fascist leader, but we've all been in jobs probably where you say, oh, well, I'll stay put, and you focus on the positives rather than the negatives. And potentially that's what's going on here as well, that it's not just kind of like one set path that they're on. And Pozzo may have been like, well, look at these things that we have achieved and not focus on the things that are perhaps less palatable.
And sorry, this is like an equally fascinating time for all this to be happening, because I think I've not mentioned it yet, but Italy was a very young country at this point. It was like 60 years old at this point in the 30s, maybe 70 years old.
Yeah, something like that.
And Italy's very similar to Britain in the sense that like regional and linguistic identities are hugely important. So the majority of people at this time would probably have thought of themselves as like Calabrian or Ligurian or wherever they're from in Italy. So for Mussolini to see this World Cup as vitally important as a way of building that Italian identity and that Italian culture, and using this national sports side as something that would embody those characteristics that he won is fascinating, and probably explains why he clearly pulled out all the stops to make sure that Italy won.
And that sort of comes back to the whole Carta de Viareggio thing as well, the use of football as the binds by which they would bring Italy together. That's how it was viewed. And you're absolutely right, Matthew. It's a very young country, very regionalized, formerly separate kingdoms and separate entities entirely. How do you bring them together into something national? Well, what is the passion? What is it that people can get into? And that's what they latched onto. And there we have it. We a few years down the line end up with 2 World Cup wins in a National League. I think it's interesting in this World Cup as well, on the footballing side of things, to bring it back to that briefly, the success they had over the other key Danubian school teams at this point. I mentioned the semi-final against Austria. Obviously, this was maybe a year or two after the prime peak of the Wunder team, as they were termed, with Matthias Sindelar and so on. But they were obviously one of the foremost national teams at the time, under Hugo Meisel. And then in the final, it was against another one, Czechoslovakia, who led until very late on in that final. Equally intriguingly, obviously Italy then equalised and won it in extra time. But intriguingly, I think one thing I've noted from the semi-final is they played Austria about 3 or 4 months before the World Cup and had a bit of a hard time against that Wunder team, a team well practiced in sort of running rings around people with their passing and slick play and positional interchange, I think, is key. And Pozzo saw his team struggle against them on that day, and he determined that if they were to face Austria again, which indeed they did, he would have a bit of a rethink, decide against going toe-to-toe with a technically adept opposition, as Austria were, instead seeking a more robust approach. Well, in keeping with the fascist view of strength and the strength they'd like to portray of Italy and the Italians, but I think it's a nice little parallel, perhaps, between his football thinking on a purely practical football term of how do we beat a technically superior opponent, is we don't try to play them at their game. We try to disrupt and try to do it a different way, a more physically robust way. But how in keeping that is, I guess, with the fascist way they're trying to promote. It's an interesting point. Chris, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think if nothing else, it shows what a deep thinker Pozzo was. He obviously learned, he learned when he was over in England, and he'd seen, I think there was this idea that he'd seen that football could be a science, not just kind of expression in a sense. And I think this is perhaps that in practice. And I suppose because of the way that it is now, we see, everyone sees football, new ideas kind of spread around really quickly. That wouldn't have been what it was during Pozzo's time. So seeing Austria up so close, it kind of probably helped develop what he did, and he took the sort of inspirations that he wanted from it and added in that sort of discipline and I suppose that sort of structure. And we know from, the way that football did develop and was still evolving at that time, there wasn't a great deal of structure, and defence wasn't something that most people kind of put too much emphasis on. And I think, you can see that, throwing it forward, you can actually see Pozzo, while he wasn't a direct influence to, things like Catenaccio, but he did lay that ground that was there. And this idea of some sort of defensive stability kind of leads, it paves the way to eventually, when you get into, the likes of Herrera and Rocco, that is where this started. And there wasn't really that sort of Italian football identity before, and national teams were so important. So Pozzo has obviously thought about that, worked out a way. And I think whether it's deliberate or not, whether it was you can give it whether it's a fascist side or not, but it's still put in this sort of idea. And you actually look at national teams, certainly in those early decades, and if they had success, that was very quickly established as the way to have success, right? So Pozzo doing that in that way, regardless of whether there's that fascism tail around it, that was how Italy won. And that's how a generation of coaches saw that was how Italy won in that time. In the same way that you see Brazil winning the way they did with their, beautiful football, the way they did it. And actually, you throw that even more forward to where they won World Cups in 94 and 2002, and they were won in very un-Brazilian ways. And they didn't quite like it. And I suppose this was then, as Brazil kind of got that sort of creative side of it, Italy established this as their identity in a sense. And Pozzo's thinking was a big part of that. And he did still make sure he had people like Meazza who had that sort of extra bit of quality, but it was all the people around, there was that structure, this sort of kind of tactical evolution in that sense. So I think that was more to do with him, rather than trying to play in a fascist way, that he wanted to be successful. And it comes back to this whole idea of he was the best man because he thought about ways to be successful.
Well, they were indeed successful, not only lifting the World Cup, intriguingly, they also lifted the Coppa del Duce with that final victory in 1934, a cup Mussolini had decided to create for himself, hugely bigger than the World Cup trophy, and present to his winning team as well in his own name. So there you go. There's another little subplot. I wonder if any modern president/dictators would think of doing things similar. We shall see. Pozzo then, he led an entirely different team to glory at the 1936 Olympics. Interestingly, wearing black shirts on occasion there. We'll come on to that in depth in a little bit as well. Then in 1938, defending their crown, they were the beneficiary of the new rules allowing the hosts and the holders to qualify automatically. But if there were any thoughts of a less controversial success, I guess that was unlikely. By this time, I guess the world has moved on 4 years, and we are very much on the brink of world war. Fascism was reaching its zenith in Germany, of course, as well as Italy, although, like as Chris said, manifesting itself in slightly different ways. But the two were becoming much closer. The relationship between Mussolini and Hitler had been growing from their first meeting, which actually came in Italy soon after the 1934 World Cup final. We also have the Spanish Civil War raging at this point, with Italy providing plenty of support for Franco's forces. If you combine that with Italian expansionist rhetoric eyeing greater power in the Mediterranean and the French lands of Corsica, Nice, and Savoy, meaning that the host France had plenty of reason to resent Italy and the Italian team that represented the nation that was posing a real threat to the French people and French land. You've also then got into the mix huge numbers of Italians who had fled the fascist regime were now living in France. Quite the combustible mix, one that soon presented the Italian team with plenty of protest. And indeed, their first match of that World Cup, which was against Norway in Marseille, so not very far from Italy, which possibly wasn't the most sensible bit of scheduling in terms of the French host. There were a lot of Italian expat protesters there to greet, shall we say, to greet their team, the team that they were very much against, it has to be noted. Then in the crowd, lots of catcalls, lots of abuse, and we have the salutes. So there's two ways of looking at the salutes, of course. One is that, as happened with Germany, indeed, of course, about a month or so before this, the England national team did a fascist salute in Berlin, which was very much around this time. It can be seen as just, I don't want to say just, but as a symbol of the nation that you're representing, something that you as an athlete and as a representative team must do. That's one way of looking at it. The other way, though, is how they actually made a bigger show of it. And again, here we delve into how much did Pozzo, how much of a true believer was he, or was he just doing what was expected of him, which is what he would claim. He was showing, in his mind, nationalism rather than fascism. But in that opening game against Norway, with all the abuse raining down while they held their salute, they waited for the abuse to die down, lowered their arms, and then raised them again as a sort of, well, I wouldn't say two fingers, obviously, as a raised arm back to the crowd, making a point, very much so. I mean, Matthew, how do you view an incident like that? A deliberate provocation, a deliberate act, a deliberate FU to the abusers? Now, is this the action of someone doing what he has to do, or is it more than nationalism?
I don't know. This is one of those choices, isn't it? Where, like, fair enough if you are in a position where you feel you can't do something because your boss is quite literally a fascist leader of your country, who, if you say something out of turn to, he'll probably have you strung up. That maybe doesn't necessarily mean you have to keep this going and to keep egging your team on to, I forget what the exact quote is. The exact quote is something about standing them down, right? Like this is a battle and we will win this battle, and gives us the edge going into the game. It's kind of what I mentioned earlier. Like, maybe this is that mindset of you're in the gladiatorial arena. This is anything goes, even if you don't necessarily agree with what you're doing or saying. If it gives you the edge, it gives you the edge, and something that should be done to help you win. But I don't know. I think this is one of those things that reflects really poorly on him, and I would imagine is possibly the lead reason why most Italians today don't want to talk about him and don't want to talk about those World Cup wins, because it shines a horrible light over both wins, really.
It does seem an unnecessary act, really. I get the whole, it's us versus the world in sporting terms. When you're getting lots of abuse, you know, the siege mentality almost of a sort of modern way of viewing it, perhaps. But it does seem it was a very deliberate act. It's going beyond the expectation of what they'd already done. That was the expectation. They're wearing the emblem, they're wearing the blue on this case, and they did the salute. To then do it again, Chris, any thoughts on that? It seems an extra step. So yeah, I think Matthew is right. This is the most obvious, egregious example that can be used against Pozzo when it comes to how he is remembered.
Yeah, I mean the symbolism of it is, there's no subtlety to that, is there? Now, I suppose the point is, I mean, they were getting a lot of abuse, and there's a possibility, Pozzo thinks it's unjust because that initial salute is what they do when they're there's the national anthems, and that's fine in his eyes. Now, is it sort of like an angry reaction to the fact of the abuse that he thinks isn't fair? Or is it kind of a symbol of we are Italy, this is what we stand for? Because there is a point that he could probably equally have made that point that, Matthew mentions around kind of showing we're going to win and this is us standing up to this. They could have stood and not reacted to having things shouted at them. And that can equally be as inflammatory because you are showing that you're above the abuse that you're receiving for whatever reason. Now, he could have made that could have been the sporting stand that he made, that they could have stood there and faced their abusers, rightly or wrongly. So to actually do it again, it feels a lot to be riling the crowd up in that sense. It all just depends on what he never really explained beyond saying that this was what we were doing and we were standing up for our country. Because it makes you think that, is that what you would do at war? Is that what he starts thinking? Is that sort of mindset that comes into it? Is this what would have been like in the First World War, that they'd have gone back? And we know that the way that they fought in the First World War, the whole idea was chuck more people in. So maybe it is kind of like a fight fire with fire approach, and that was just the mentality at the time. But certainly the pictures that go alongside this, and there is no doubting, what is going on in these pictures, that goes on to characterize what Pozzo's Italy stand for, whether it's Pozzo himself, but certainly the team. And you can't take that away from anything that they've won. I mean, that is a really important part of who Italy were at the time and those World Cup successes. And that was Pozzo's decision. And he has to, whether he went on to regret about that or not, he is the person that made that decision to make them hold that salute for a second time.
For what I've read and seen on this, he seems to have been slightly taken aback by how many Italians were against them. And I don't know whether that's when you're inside Italy, you don't realize the way Italy is being perceived by others, but that seems a little short-sighted. But he does seem slightly slighted by that, and sort of as a battle of intimidation. He remarked on how the voices and so on that he was hearing in the crowd and in the protests in and around Marseille were Italian voices, not French ones, for the most part anyway. Intriguingly, also, the Italian press talked about how welcome the team were in Marseille. Well, the truth was rather different. The Italian forward Ugo Locatelli talked about several thousand protesters having to be controlled by baton-wielding police. So that doesn't seem that it was that polite reception that the Italian newspapers talked about. Yeah, the quote that he talked about was about when he raised the hands again. He said, having won the battle of intimidation, we played the match. So that's how he's portrayed it. But again, in aftermath, that wasn't at the time. I don't think this is quotes looking back. So you can repaint things how you wish. But yes, that they got past Norway on that occasion, intimidation or not. And that took them to a quarterfinal against France. Now, I've talked of a number of reasons why France had plenty of resentment towards Italy. There are even more we could throw in as well. There was among the huge numbers of Italians who had fled the regime was rather significant and influential Italian anti-fascist leader Carlo Rosselli. He'd been imprisoned by Mussolini in the 20s and early 30s. He'd lived in exile in France since the early 1930s. He'd had rumours of plots to assassinate Mussolini. He was an advocate of an expansion of the Spanish Civil War into a Europe-wide anti-fascist war. So, very much not the type of person that Mussolini was going to be a fan of. Now, he was ultimately murdered along with his brother in Normandy in 1937, June 37. So basically 1 year before this match. The Italian press obviously made great play of this as being done by anti-fascist communists. It was actually a French far-right group, not linked to Mussolini, who had done this. Huge funeral in Paris in 1937, huge collection of Italian and French anti-fascist supporters there, stirred up by that. So we've got that to add into the mix. We've also got, in general, I've talked a lot about the Franco-Italian relations. Well, there's also the attempt to, appeasement and so on going on around, or beginning to go on around this time. We had the Easter Accords, which was an agreement between Britain and Italy aimed at preventing an alliance between Italy and Germany. That went well, trying to maintain the world order as it was, but this then put a wedge almost between Britain and France to some extent, or at least from Italian perspective, it was aimed at doing so. So it was a bit about destabilizing things. Off the back of all these protests that we got going on, we then have Italy having to play France in a quarterfinal in Colombes, just north of Paris, the Olympic Stadium, Chariots of Fire fame and all of that. Now, those of us who are well aware of what colours these teams normally wear will note that they both wear blue, and you can't have that. Now, there was a toss of coin to decide who would wear their home colours, and France won that. So Italy had to change. Their change kit of the day was white, all white. Perfect. That would work just fine. Only the directive came from Italy, from Rome, and presumably from Mussolini himself, that rather than wear white on this occasion, his Italian side would take the field in this quarterfinal, in this combustible atmosphere, just north of Paris, against the hosts, wearing all black. This is the colour, the uniform of the fascist militia, the squadrismo, as it was termed in Italy. We know the same about the black shirts in Germany and what all that stands for. It was adorned, of course, with the Fascio Littorio emblem, a rather oversized one, as it was in those days. This is quite the political statement. Now, this isn't Pozzo. We can't pin this on him. But I guess it all just adds into the mix of what was going on at this time, the provocation, I guess, that they would view that they're fighting back against. But it's, again, another antagonistic approach to the French crowd, and of course the significant number of Italian expats in the crowd. It was a red rag to a bull, protest and derision. And then, of course, before the match, they do the salute, as they have to again. I mean, this is quite the symbolism that we're talking here, Matthew, isn't it? It's extreme.
It's provocative and deliberate, and I find it interesting how it sort of still echoes even today. I think about Hungary and the black shirts that are always in the stands now. That's a whole other podcast, isn't it? Like Viktor Orban and that his brand of far right politics that uses football to further his interests. It is provocative statement, and I guess, like you say, one that we can't pin on Pozzo this time, but again, one that as Chris made the point earlier, like at what point as a manager of the team and you decisions are being made without you, and you're constantly being undercut by your boss, and at what point is it your win, and what point is it Italy's win or Mussolini's win, or it's a bad look, and a really bad look. And again, just to echo what we said earlier, but it again shows why a lot of people won't want to talk about this. I mean, it'd be impossible to talk about these games without seeing the giant, whatever. Your Italian is much better than mine, but the giant fascist logos on the shirts and stuff like that. So, uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable indeed. Chris, any thoughts on this element of it, the symbolism of it all?
The swirl of noise around it. I mean, there was nothing that could have been done. And this is the question for Pozzo. that this was going to happen regardless of whether he was the manager or somebody else was the manager. And this is where again it comes to what is his option? How easy would it have been for him to quit? How important was he considered within Italy as the man who led them to the success, or was it the players, or was it what we the everything that was going on around it? And could he have stepped away following success in 34 and at the Olympics in 36? Was that ever a possibility for him? And I suppose this is what we'll never know. And this is why there is that sort of question mark, isn't there? Because you'd think by today's standards, you look at it and you think you'd move away from it. There were loads of Italians that had left Italy because they didn't agree with Pozzo and were in France and were in the crowd reportedly during this World Cup. So, could Pozzo have done the same? He'd already lived in Lyon, so could he have done the same? And this is it, how much choice did he have? So, was he kind of like behind closed doors? Was he not happy seeing all this kind of happening around him? Or, was it something that he was more kind of subservient to? I don't know. And this is the thing that we will never know, I suppose. And this is why there is this sort of feeling of where does Pozzo fit in? But here, look, he didn't have an influence with it. But, was there a point that he could have said no?
Well, that is the intriguing question. That is it. We will never be able to answer, of course, would we? But yes, it does all add into the mix of what the man, the football man Pozzo, was. Now, on that particular occasion, Italy were clearly the superior team. They got past France relatively comfortably. Interestingly, they actually played, France and Italy had played in December 1937 in Paris as well, a 0-0 draw on that occasion. But that one, talking of all the protests and all the other shenanigans going on around it, that had taken months of planning after a previous attempt at playing the fixture had to be binned due to planned protests from the French Front Populaire, among others. But of course, a World Cup forces them together on an even grander stage than all of that, and quite a combustible mix. Italy do, of course, go on to retain that World Cup, making Pozzo the first and currently still only man to retain the trophy as manager. They got past Brazil in the semi-final and then Hungary in the final. So ultimately, their two World Cup successes have come against teams of the Danubian school of football, but I think interestingly and probably importantly, nations they were well used to facing regularly in the Mitropa Cup and other sort of Central European competitions around that time, which probably helped.
Am I right in thinking that there are also question marks around that final against Hungary as well? Because there was, I could be making this totally up now, but I think in my research I saw that there are a lot of links between Mussolini and the Hungarian government. And is there a quote by the Hungarian keeper that's like,
Yep.
Today I let in 10 goals, but I saved 11 lives, or something like that. Which, like, there's not one game in this run of two World Cups that isn't tainted.
Not quite 10 goals, but you're absolutely right in terms of the quote. That is
probably ruined your intro there. Sorry, Aidan. But
no, not at all. You're absolutely right. Yes, he did say that, and again, it's hard to know whether that is projecting things or whether that's somebody, I don't know, trying to put a different gloss on defeat, or whether that is a genuine fear. What is also true is that the team received a telegram from Mussolini advance of the final saying vincere o morire, if my pronunciation is remotely close, which means victory or die. Now, again, the talk of this is you can take that literally, of course, and from everything I've read about that is not really how it would be taken by an Italian, either at that time or in general. It's more a sort of win or bust type of a statement, I guess, rather than the literal death term. I guess when those of us are sort of looking back at it now, it's easy to see a comment and a statement like that and just think, well, okay, we're talking fascist era, that must be a literal comment. But no, I don't think that was the case. But it does add an extra little bit of intrigue and mix into it. I mean, Chris, those two things, the quote Matthew's mentioning there and that telegram from the regime, they just add to it all, I guess, don't they? It just makes it even more of a fascinating and controversial World Cup victory in terms of its symbolism, what it meant, and of course, therefore, by extension, on the people who delivered it.
It does, and I think this is the myth of that letter and what the connotations were. Again, this is where we've got to remember what who are the people that are telling this story now. This was post-war kind of recollections of this victory, so they were never going to portray Italy's win in either 34, but definitely in 38 in a positive light. Therefore, I'm sure it wouldn't be beyond, let's say England get to the World Cup final in 2026, you would expect that at some point Keir Starmer would send a message to that English team to say, good luck. Now, the way that that's going to be perceived nowadays, clearly Keir Starmer isn't threatening the lives of Harry Kane, but that's not an unusual thing to happen, especially if, as we've kind of spoken about, the sporting propaganda was such a big deal for Mussolini. And this is where how much of what we hear around this stuff is theatre, how much of this is kind of like history retold in a particular way. And yeah, I mean, it makes it fascinating. And I think that's what kind of like, I think that's the sort of draw, is that there's so much certainty, particularly in sport, when you're kind of saying, look, this is the result, this was the team that did it, and you can dissect how it was done. But actually, I think because of all this stuff around it, there are so many questions about why and who and how much of an impact all of this had. And I think that's what makes this such an intriguing World Cup, and possibly, one of the most intriguing World Cups ever, because there is so much around it. And we're not short of World Cups that have got a lot of kind of question marks around it. There's a lot of politics around it, but this one, because it is the runway into the Second World War, is probably, I would say, is the most intriguing of a lot of them.
I cannot wait for Keir Starmer to send a win or die message to Harry Kane and the boys this summer. That will be hilarious.
Well, there's a certain ICE organization in the USA that might take that a bit more literally as well, of course, isn't it? Yeah. All of this feeds into a more hypothetical question, and something you put in the notes for this, Chris, is if Pozzo had failed, I guess 1934 might be even more applicable for 38 in that everything you talked about there. If he'd failed, what would have happened to him? Die is a bit extreme, but what might have happened had he not delivered on what the regime were obviously hell-bent on ensuring he delivered?
He was also a prominent journalist, and he wrote for La Stampa, which was state-owned newspaper, and he continues to do that actually post-war as well, once he's kind of been marginalised and kind of, he loses his role with the Italian national team, but he still maintains a high-profile position as a football commentator. Now, if he'd have lost, or disobeyed, he would have been widely discredited, as was the case. This is the way that it worked, that he would be widely discredited, and that would have been not just kind of like his football coaching, but most probably his role as a journalist as well. And if you are a failure and painted as a failure, even if not kind of like threatening his safety, that's the sort of thing that would likely to have been an impact, that he probably, disappears into insignificance. Where would he have gone? What job would he have done? How would people have viewed him? And that would probably be what would have happened. I would imagine that there would be sort of like a social ostracizing of him rather than a physical threat. But obviously you don't know. I mean, that was the time, but it wasn't sort of, there never seems to be an actual, any sort of inclination, any indication, rather, that Pozzo was under any threat to his life if he didn't perform and he didn't obey. But of course, we don't know that. But there's never anything that has been written that suggests that. Which, considering what has been written and what has been suggested, that is probably, we can probably read into that and understand that he probably wasn't likely to be killed, despite the myths around it. I think that seems to be the thing. It wasn't perhaps a threat to his life, but who knows?
Who knows, indeed. But what did, of course, happen is that the regime ultimately fell during the Second World War. And then, of course, you've got the post-war era where you have a lot of, I don't know, history being told by those or rewritten by those who were involved at the time in some extent at certain times. And you get this in Germany, but equally in Italy. Now, he's been described by some historians as just a man in silence, someone who showed anti-fascist tendencies at times. So there's examples of him using contacts in both the army and Red Cross to smuggle parcels and other things to imprison players and journalists, some of which were publicly opposed to fascism. So again, that's a sort of positive mark in his regard, but equally we can't completely ignore everything that had gone before. This all plays into how he's remembered, how he's viewed. He was shunned, as you've alluded to, Chris, I guess, in terms of sporting history for some time. His achievements only really were properly recognised, his impact on Italian football, probably not until his death, which was many years later. So, Matthew, how do you think we're able to judge him in the immediate aftermath of that time? Obviously, he was judged very poorly. It's taken a long time to sort of alter that perception and alter that view and probably give a more balanced approach, if that's right.
I think there's a couple of answers to that, because in the aftermath of the Second World War, when Mussolini's regime falls, and rightly or wrongly, he is associated with that. So it's understandable why the wider Italian public would rather not celebrate those Italian World Cup wins and not celebrate Pozzo. And I know there's a lot of chatter about him maybe having a stadium named after him in Turin, and they ultimately decided not to, because but by association, are you celebrating fascism essentially? So maybe it's better to just not talk about it. In the longer term, it still stays complicated, doesn't it? Because as we've said all through this, like there were opportunities along the way, choices to make that he made that reflect poorly on him, and rightly or wrongly, that stain is difficult to remove. Something I wanted to mention, I found fascinating that like some of his post-war work with La Stampa saw that he was involved in identifying the players' bodies after the Superga air disaster, where the Grande Torino team were killed in the late 40s. Because obviously he was still a journalist at the time for La Stampa and knew a lot of the players because they had played for a lot of the national sides. So, I mean, his life stayed interesting and dramatic after the World War and after Mussolini fell. That must have been quite a traumatic experience to go through. Literally walking through a plane wreckage to identify bodies of people that you knew and worked with. His life stayed interesting after that, but ultimately one is one I understand why people would rather not talk about.
And it's interesting you mentioned the stadium thing, and obviously he hasn't had one named after him, whereas his most significant player does have a stadium named after him in one of the names given to it anyway, the Giuseppe Meazza in Milan. It's interesting then that the stigma hasn't fallen on him, despite as a person being a part of the fascist youth. Again, did he have any choice in the matter? But he was, and played in these two World Cup winning teams under Pozzo, and yet one can have a stadium named after him and the other can't. It's interesting how that goes. Chris, any sort of final thoughts on Pozzo and his legacy and the question you posed in the notes at one point: can tactical genius survive moral compromise?
Yeah, I mean, he does. Well, he didn't get a stadium. He does have a museum named after him, but not in a particularly or dedicated to him. But it's not a particularly high-profile museum. I believe it's in Ponderano. So it's not it's not a widely. There's not big footfall there, but he does get something at the end of it, and there is a sort of a feeling of his impact on Italian football that comes after his death. But yeah, I think it's the one bit that perhaps you mentioned he's involved in kind of those anti-fascist tendencies and sending stuff and helping imprison players and journalists. There are little bits that show dissent and signs of him, the moral compass that might have been there, may have existed. Because so many people were paid up fascist members. Pozzo wasn't. So was were there little indications that these were the little wins for him, and this is how he kind of justified to himself that it was okay what he was doing, alongside, or the whole choice situation. I think also there's a lot of things where he talks about stuff, and it's post-war, and it probably, again, it's of his time, and you don't know how influenced was he by the environment that he was in. Things happening. His son was killed in action in 43 while fighting for Italy, and he perhaps sees then there's that sort of real sort of personal hit of the impact that the wars have had on his family. And he couldn't have mistaken what that looked like in previous wars, but it kind of hits home just that little bit closer. And some of the things that he talks about, he says, I served Italy twice, first with a rifle, then with a whistle. I only regret that both left me death. Talking about kind of the gunfire and also kind of the criticism that he received too. And perhaps that kind of molds some of the post-war Pozzoisms that are there. And I think, undoubtedly, he is someone who acted based on what he thought was right and was within his best interest at the time. And whether you can kind of pin him down either way is really difficult. And it's how much you can take what Pozzo talks about post-war to what he talks about pre-Second World War. Where does he fit? And it may well be, as is the case with a lot of people, his opinions change, and he may well have become more educated. He may as well have seen the other side of fascism post-war because people shared what the impact was and he wasn't aware of it. So there is all of this. You've got people like Sepp Herberger, who goes on to be West Germany manager, and he served in the Wehrmacht. Where do these people sit? And, you had to exist in society somewhere. And this was just where Pozzo landed. And I think there is a point that if he was, if there was a situation now and he was serving, there'd be massive questions around him. But I think there may be a little bit of 2026 vision being applied to something that happened in the 1930s, potentially. It doesn't fully justify it, but it perhaps does go to explain some of his actions, I would suggest.
It's also probably important to mention that it's incredibly difficult to survive in this sort of country with this sort of scenario. Like our cinema, our cultural history is full of movies and TV shows and books and things about how difficult it is to survive and to work and to live and to pursue your passions in this sort of environment where any sort of dissent will be stamped down upon and you'll be punished in physical and harmful ways. So it's probably all we can do is project our thoughts onto the sort of blank canvas that is Vittorio Pozzo, but we have the little hints that he was anti-fascist and that he did his part to feed soldiers and to get message sent through the system. So as Chris says, maybe they were his little ways of rebelling. And again, it's difficult to survive in these sort of countries when a brutal, crushing regime is in charge of it.
Okay, well, brilliant. I mean, we could probably continue talking for just as long as we already have on all the intriguing questions that the era and the person poses. I guess what is clear with Vittorio Pozzo is he delivered what was a hugely significant footballing achievement of back-to-back World Cup successes, something that no one else has achieved as a manager. He delivered Olympic gold in between that as well. He showed tactical strength and adaptability. So in terms of all that footballing elements, he was clearly a hugely significant and important and impressive character. And then we have obviously delved into some of the other aspects that go alongside it all, which just adds to the intrigue, the fascination and the mix and the complexities of judging somebody from a rather significant era in history, shall we say. Well, let's leave it there. One final word, though, for Chris, your book, How to Win a World Cup. Your second edition is out there now, I take it.
Out in May, but you can still get
Out
the
in
other one
May.
in hardback. But yeah, the other one, so it's a second edition, updated one with everything from the 2022 World Cup. So yeah, that the paperback is out then, but obviously the first edition packed full of interviews, different managers and players from the different eras. So that's available. Amazon, Bloomsbury website, all sorts of different places. So yeah, keep an eye out.
Perfect. It is a fabulous read, which I obviously have to get a hold of the latest version, won't I, to find out what's going on in there. But I thoroughly enjoyed the original one back around the time of the last World Cup. I'm sure it's still in similar vein. So there we go. We shall leave things there. Thank you very much, guys, Chris and Matthew, both of you, for joining me on this one and for delving into some very tricky and in-depth areas. It's been really fascinating. This has been, you have to say, that's magnificent. Our World Cup branch of your boys took a hell of a beating. Do join us again for more amongst the various pods we will bring out, and give us a follow on whatever platform you can. Thank you and goodbye.